Caroline Alden had sewn her wedding dress in 4 different states, stitching a new hem in Missouri when the first one tore, replacing a button in Kansas after it rolled beneath the seat of a lurching stagecoach, adding a strip of ivory lace she bought from a traveling merchant in Colorado just because it was beautiful, and she wanted to believe beauty still had a place in a life held together by hope and railroad tickets. And now, with the red dust of New Mexico blowing across the platform of Redemption Station, she smoothed the front of her traveling coat over the folded dress in her carpetbag and stepped off the train into the blistering June afternoon of 1883, certain that the hard part was finally behind her. She was wrong about that. She had been wrong about a great many things since the letter arrived in March, written in a careful, slanted hand on paper that smelled faintly of pine resin and leather. The letter had come from a man named Gerald Whitmore, a rancher in the New Mexico Territory who had placed an advertisement in the Missouri Matrimonial Gazette, seeking a woman of sound character and practical temperament for the purposes of marriage and the building of a proper household. Caroline had read the advertisement 4 times before she allowed herself to respond, and she had written 3 drafts of her reply before settling on a tone that was honest without being desperate, warm without being forward. She was 26 years old, a schoolteacher whose contract had not been renewed after the town of Claremont decided it preferred a male instructor, and she had exactly $42 and a small trunk of belongings to her name. She was not a woman without options, but she was a woman who understood that the options available to her were narrowing with the particular cruelty that the 1880s reserved for unmarried women of modest means. Gerald Whitmore had written back. His letters were not poetic, but they were decent and they were direct, and he had described his property outside the town of Redemption with a straightforward pride that she had found oddly appealing. He had a cattle operation, 300 head, a house with glass windows, and a well that had never gone dry in 11 years. He was 40 years old, a widower, and he wanted a wife who would not be frightened by hard work or empty country. Caroline had written to him for 6 weeks before accepting his proposal, and then she had given herself 3 more weeks to settle her affairs in Claremont, sell what little furniture she owned, say goodbye to the handful of people who would notice her absence, and pack everything she intended to carry into a new life. The journey had taken 9 days. 9 days of railroad cars and stagecoaches, and 1 long, miserable night in a way station outside Pueblo, where a traveling salesman had tried to engage her in a conversation about face creams, until she fixed him with the precise look she used on unruly students, and he had relocated to the far end of the bench. 9 days of eating cold biscuits and dried fruit and watching the landscape transform from the green and rolling hills of Missouri into the wide, burning distances of the Southwest, where the sky seemed to press down on the earth with a physical weight, and the distances between one thing and the next could swallow a person whole. But she had made it. She was here, standing on the platform of Redemption Station with her carpetbag in one hand and her small trunk at her feet, and all that remained was for Gerald Whitmore to appear as promised and escort her to the Redemption Courthouse for the civil ceremony he had arranged, and then she would be a married woman with glass windows and a well that had never gone dry. Except Gerald Whitmore did not appear. The platform emptied slowly as the other passengers dispersed into the town or were collected by waiting parties, and the train groaned back to life and pulled away in a billow of steam and cinder smell, and still no one approached her. The station agent, a round-faced man of perhaps 50 with a walrus mustache and an ink stain on his right thumb, watched her from behind the ticket window with an expression she could not quite read. When she had waited 20 minutes and it was clear that no one was coming, she picked up her carpetbag and walked to the window. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice very steady. "I am looking for a Mr. Gerald Whitmore. I was told he would be meeting this train." The station agent's expression shifted, and she understood immediately that it was an expression of regret. the particular uncomfortable regret of a man who has been given bad news to deliver to a stranger. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. "You'd be Miss Alden," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "Ma'am," he said, and then he stopped and cleared his throat and started again. "Ma'am, I am very sorry to have to tell you this. Gerald Whitmore passed away 3 days ago. It was his heart. It happened sudden-like in the evening while he was eating his supper. His foreman, a man named Dale Pryor, rode in yesterday to let us know, and to ask that someone notify anyone who might be coming." The silence that followed that sentence was so absolute that Caroline could hear the wind pushing dust across the platform boards behind her. "He is gone," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I am sorry. I truly am." She stood at that window for a long moment and let the information settle into her bones the way cold water settles into dry earth. Gerald Whitmore, whom she had never met but had spent 3 months constructing a careful, tentative future around, was dead. She was standing in a town she had never been to before, in a territory she had arrived in approximately 40 minutes ago, with $42, a carpetbag, a small trunk, and a wedding dress that had never been worn. "Thank you," she said, because she had been raised to be gracious even when graciousness was the last thing she felt. "Is there a hotel in Redemption?" "Yes, ma'am." "The Copper Bell, 2 blocks east on Main Street. Miss Alden, if you need anything else, if you have questions or need help making arrangements to travel back, my name is Hector Graves and I am at this window until 6 in the evening." She nodded. She picked up her carpetbag. She walked off the platform and down the steps into the red dust of Main Street, Redemption, New Mexico territory. And she kept her back very straight and her chin level, because she was not going to cry in the street of a town full of strangers, and she was especially not going to cry over a man she had never met. Even if the grief that was pressing against the back of her throat was less about Gerald Whitmore specifically, and more about the particular exhaustion of a woman who had tried everything sensible and still ended up with nothing. Main Street was exactly what she would have expected of a cattle town in the New Mexico territory in 1883. Wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other without incident, unpaved and dusty, lined on both sides with wooden storefronts, whose facades rose 2 stories into the brilliant blue sky even when the buildings behind them were only 1. There was a general store, a land office, a barber shop, a saloon whose piano was already active despite the early afternoon hour, a blacksmith whose hammer rang out in a steady, reassuring rhythm, and a doctor's office with a painted sign above the door. The Copper Bell Hotel sat at the corner of Main and 2nd, a 2-story building with a covered porch, and a pair of rocking chairs that were currently occupied by 2 old men who looked as though they had been placed there at the establishment of the town, and had not moved since. She took a room on the upper floor. It was small but clean, with a window that overlooked an alley and a small corral where someone's horse stood with great philosophical patience in the afternoon heat. She set her carpetbag on the bed and her trunk against the wall and sat down on the edge of the mattress, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She had $42. The train ticket back to Missouri would cost approximately $30. That left $12, which was not enough to restart anything. Her position in Claremont was gone. The small furnished room she had rented there was already relet. She had no family remaining in Missouri, her mother having died 2 years ago and her father a year before that, and the 2 aunts who remained in St. Louis were kind women who would take her in out of duty but would never let her forget the cost of that kindness. She could stay in Redemption. That thought arrived with surprising steadiness. She was a qualified teacher. Redemption was a growing town and growing towns needed teachers. She had $42, which was enough to live very carefully for 2 or 3 months while she established herself. She had done harder things than this. She had crossed 4 states alone with a wedding dress in her bag, and she had done it with her chin up, and she could certainly manage to build a life in a New Mexico cattle town. The decision, once made, settled something in her chest, and she rose from the mattress and washed her face in the basin and went back downstairs to ask the hotel proprietor, a thin woman named Mrs. Peabody, whether she knew of any need for a schoolteacher in Redemption or the surrounding area. Mrs. Peabody knew everything about Redemption, and she was delighted to tell most of it to a captive audience. Redemption did indeed need a teacher. The previous one had left in February after deciding that the territory was not for him, which Mrs. Peabody said with a tone that suggested she had not been surprised. The school board consisted of 3 men, all of whom could be found most evenings at the meeting hall attached to the Baptist church. She should speak to a Mr. Franklin Ames, who was the board chairman and who ran the general store. And she should do it soon because there had been talk of bringing someone in from Santa Fe, and if that happened, the spot would be filled. Caroline thanked Mrs. Peabody, smoothed her coat, and went to the general store. Franklin Ames was a compact, efficient man who listened to her qualifications with his arms folded and his head tilted, and then asked her 3 questions about grammar, one about arithmetic, and one about her views on physical discipline in the classroom. She answered all of them correctly, and he shook her hand and told her she could start in September, which was 6 weeks away. The pay was $20 a month, with the use of the small house behind the school building included. He would have the other board members sign the contract by the end of the week. She walked back out into the late afternoon sunlight and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the feeling of a woman who has just watched her footing shift from uncertain ground to something solid, and that was when she heard the voice behind her. "Excuse me, you're not from here." It was not a question in the way the station agent's identification of her had been a question. It was simply an observation, delivered with a directness that startled her into turning around rather faster than was dignified. The man standing behind her was perhaps 30, lean and weathered in the way that men who spent most of their time outdoors became weathered, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the sky at the edge of a storm, not quite gray and not quite blue, but something of both. He was wearing a work-worn canvas coat despite the heat, and there was a smear of something that might have been axle grease on his left forearm, and he was carrying a paper bag of something that clinked softly when he shifted his weight, which he did when she turned around, as if he had not quite expected her to turn around so quickly. "I am not," she said. "I arrived today." "By the afternoon train," he said, and then looked as if he wished he hadn't said it. "You saw me at the station. I had a delivery to make. I wasn't watching, I just noticed. It's a small town." He cleared his throat. "I heard what Hector told you about Whitmore. I apologize for that. It's a hard thing to arrive to." She regarded him steadily. He did not look away, which she noted as a point in his favor. Men who delivered uncomfortable truths with their eyes level tended to be telling the truth. "It is," she said, "but I've made arrangements to stay. I've just accepted a position with the school board." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it, a recalibration of some prior assessment. "Stephen Collier," he said, and he shifted the paper bag to his left hand and extended his right. "Caroline Alden," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go promptly, which she also noted. "You're ranching?" she asked, because the canvas coat and the axle grease and the general quality of self-sufficiency about him suggested it. "I run the Collier spread, about 8 miles north. I come into town on Fridays mostly, and for deliveries." He raised the paper bag slightly. "Nails," she guessed. He looked surprised. "Hinges close." "The weight," she said. He almost smiled. It did not quite complete itself, but it arrived at the edge of his mouth and stayed there for a moment before he controlled it. "I should let you get settled," he said. "You should," she agreed. "It was nice to meet you, Mr. Collier." "Miss Alden," he said, with a slight nod that was almost a bow but was too self-conscious to complete itself, and he walked away down the boardwalk with the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be but moved as though every step was purposeful anyway. She watched him go for exactly 3 seconds before she reminded herself that she was a sensible woman who had just had a significant disappointment and was not in any condition to be noticing the way men walked. And she turned and went back into the hotel to write a letter to her aunts in St. Louis explaining that she was safe, employed, and would not be needing the guest room. The 6 weeks between her arrival and the start of the school term in September were the most educating of her life, and she had spent years in the education business. Redemption was a town in the particular state of becoming, that unsettled, energetic condition of a place that knows it is growing, but has not yet decided what it is growing into. It had arrived with the cattle trade and was now being complicated by the arrival of the railroad proper, by land speculators from the east, by families moving into the territory from Texas and Kansas, and even further east than that, and by the general American talent for building something profitable in the middle of a desert, and then being surprised when the desert made it difficult. She set to work on the schoolhouse, which needed sweeping and the replacement of 2 window panes, and a general reorganization of the books that had been left in various states of disarray. She introduced herself to the families in town who had school-age children, knocking on doors and sitting in parlors and drinking strong coffee, while mothers looked her over with the frank appraisal of women who were entrusting their children to a stranger. She was generally well received. She was a Missouri woman, practical and steady, and the territory respected practicality. She encountered Stephen Collier again on the second Friday after her arrival at the general store where she was purchasing paper and ink. He was at the counter ahead of her, ordering a supply of coffee and lamp oil and other items that he read off a list in his careful hand, and when he turned and saw her, he did something with his face that was not quite flushing but was in that general direction. "Miss Alden," he said. "Mr. Collier," she said. "Friday delivery again." "Supplies," he said. "The ranch goes through a great deal of coffee. How many men do you run?" "4 hands, and my foreman, Tom Bright." He folded his list and put it in his coat pocket. "How are you settling in?" "Better than expected," she said, which was true. "I've met most of the families with school-age children. They seem like good people." "Redemption's a decent town," he said, with the particular neutral endorsement of someone who had a genuine affection for a place, but was not quite willing to be enthusiastic about it in front of someone who had come from somewhere presumably better. "It can be rough around the edges." "I have found rough edges to be manageable," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those storm-colored eyes and then said, very carefully, as if he had been considering the question for some time and had decided to ask it before he talked himself out of it, "Would you do me the honor of having supper with me this evening? At the hotel dining room. I should have asked properly and in advance, and I apologize for the informality." She considered him. He was standing very still, the way people stood when they were waiting for something they were not sure they deserved. "Yes," she said. "That would be very nice, Mr. Collier." The relief in his face was so unguarded and immediate that she found herself unexpectedly moved by it. He nodded once, collected his supplies from Mr. Ames, and said he would call for her at 7. He was exactly on time. She had changed into her better dress, the blue one with the small white collar that her mother had helped her make 4 years ago, and that she reserved for occasions that deserved it. He was waiting at the foot of the hotel stairs in a clean shirt and a jacket that fit him properly, and he had combed his hair, though one piece near the back refused the discipline and stood up slightly, which she found so humanizing that she had to concentrate very hard on maintaining a composed expression. The hotel dining room was not elaborate, but it was warm and well lit, and Mrs. Peabody had clearly taken care with the tables, which were set with actual cloth napkins and small glasses of water. They ordered the roast beef, because it was what there was, and they talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes, which was not what Caroline had expected from a man who had seemed, in their brief encounters, to be of the economical variety with words. He had come to the territory 8 years ago from Virginia, he told her, after the death of his father left him with a choice between an older brother who had already claimed the family farm with a comfortable certainty that left no room for a second son, and the West, which was at least generous with its space. He had arrived in New Mexico with $400 and a particular stubbornness about not failing, and he had built his operation slowly and carefully and without spectacle, and it was now solid enough that he could sleep through the night without lying awake calculating numbers, which he said was his personal measure of financial security. "You built it alone?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "Tom Bright has been with me 6 years. He's the most capable man I know. I couldn't have grown the operation the way I did without him." He paused. "And the land is good. That matters more than people acknowledge. A man can work himself to exhaustion on bad land and have nothing to show for it. Good land will meet a man halfway if he respects it." "You sound like you love it," she said. He looked slightly startled, as if love was not a word he had expected to find in a conversation about ranching. Then he settled back in his chair and considered. "I suppose I do," he said. "The land out here does something to you. All that space. In Virginia there were always other people's fences. Here the distances are so large they almost feel like permission." She understood that completely, and she said so, and something in the conversation shifted after that, becoming easier and more open, the way conversations did when two people discovered they were thinking about the same thing from different angles. He asked her about Missouri, and she told him about Claremont, about the school and the parents and the particular small politics of a small town that had decided it wanted a man in the schoolroom, because a man was what respectable institutions had. Never mind that she had been teaching their children to read and do sums for 3 years and doing it well. "That was unjust," he said, without hedging or qualifying it. "It was," she agreed. "It was also unfortunately common. That doesn't make it less unjust." She looked at him across the table. "No," she said, "it doesn't." They talked about books. She had brought 12 with her in her trunk, and he had a collection of perhaps 40 on the shelf above his fireplace, accumulated over 8 years of ordering from a catalog in Santa Fe, and they had 3 titles in common and argued pleasantly about one of them for 20 minutes. He walked her back to the hotel at 9:30 and stood at the foot of the porch steps and said, very formally, that he hoped she had enjoyed the evening. "I did," she said from the top step, which put her at almost exactly his eye level. "Very much. I come into town every Friday," he said. "I know," she said. "I would like to repeat the invitation if that would be acceptable." "It would be," she said. He nodded, and she went inside, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the room with the alley view and acknowledged to herself that she was in very grave danger of doing something entirely unplanned. The Fridays became the architecture of her weeks. She spent Monday through Thursday teaching. The school opened in September with 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and the work of organizing them into something resembling an educational institution kept her fully occupied. And on Friday afternoons she found herself aware of the time in a particular way, noting when it was 4 o'clock, and then 5, and then 6, and then finally 7, when Stephen Collier appeared at the foot of the hotel stairs, and then, after the second week, at the door of the small house behind the school building, to which she had moved the first week of September. They had supper at the hotel dining room, or when Mrs. Peabody was hosting a private function, at the small restaurant that had opened on 2nd Street in early October, run by a woman named Marguerite Salazar, whose green chili was widely agreed to be the finest in the territory. They walked along the edge of town in the long autumn evenings when the heat had dropped to something bearable, and the sky went through its nightly performance of colors that she had never seen in Missouri, and had begun to understand were one of the territory's compensations for everything it asked of a person. They talked about everything, with a particular ease that she had never found with anyone else, the ease of people who are sufficiently different to be interesting to each other and sufficiently alike to understand the references. She learned that he was 31, that he had a dry sense of humor that arrived without announcement and was gone before you were quite sure it had been there. That he was meticulous about small things, the tools in his workshop, the account books for the ranch, the maintenance of his fences, and that this meticulousness was not anxiety but a form of respect for the work. That he was capable of sitting in silence without filling it with noise, which was a quality she valued enormously. That he had opinions about everything from water rights to territorial politics, to the reliability of the new Colt revolvers that cowboys were favoring over the older models, and that he delivered these opinions without requiring her to agree with them. She learned, more slowly, and in the way you learn things about a person who is being careful about what he shows, that he was lonely. Not in the self-pitying way of a man who wanted to be noticed for his suffering, but in the quiet, deep way of someone who had spent a long time in large, empty spaces and had built something good, and had no one to turn to at the end of the day and say, "Look at what we made." That particular loneliness, the loneliness of unreceived achievement, was one she understood from the inside. He learned things about her too. She could see it happening, week by week. That process of patient, careful attention that was his characteristic approach to everything he considered worth understanding. He asked her questions about her teaching and listened to the answers with the genuine interest of someone who found the subject itself interesting, not just the person speaking. He noticed things, when she was tired after a difficult week, when something was worrying her, when she was happy about something and trying not to show it too much. He did not remark on these observations in a way that would have felt intrusive, but he adjusted for them, suggesting a walk instead of a restaurant when she needed air, finding a reason to make her laugh when she needed laughing. In October, he drove her out to the ranch for the first time. She had asked to see it, not as any kind of implication about the future, but because he had described it so precisely in his letters. She realized with a small private shock, and then corrected herself. He had described it so thoroughly in their conversations that she had formed a picture of it and wanted to see if the picture was accurate. The road north from Redemption ran through a landscape that was so beautiful in its austerity that it made her chest ache a little. The mesas rose in the middle distance, red and gold in the morning light, and the scrub was silver green, and the sky was the particular ruthless blue that she had come to consider the sky's true color, the one it wore when it was not performing for anyone. The ranch appeared after about 40 minutes of driving, a compound of wooden buildings set in the shelter of a low ridge, with corrals on the east side and a vegetable garden on the south that had been recently put to bed for winter. The house was not grand. It was solid and well built, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and glass windows as Gerald Whitmore had also advertised, though she found herself noting that without the uncomfortable weight of their original context. Inside it was clean and spare, with the particular quality of a space that has been organized by someone who knows what they need and has no interest in excess. The shelf of books above the fireplace was real, and she stood before it for several minutes running her eyes along the spines and feeling an odd, warm recognition. Tom Bright was in the yard when they arrived, a quiet black man of about 40 with steady eyes and a handshake that communicated immediate competence and dignity. He treated her with a courteous directness that she responded to instinctively, and she noticed that Stephen spoke to him, not with the condescension that she had seen white men use too often with black workers, but with the genuine respect of a man addressing someone he considered a partner in the enterprise. In a territory and a time that did not always make that easy, she found it meaningful. She met the four hands, two brothers from Texas named Caldwell and a quiet man from Mexico named Ernesto, who spoke little English but who smiled with great warmth and seemed to find her attempts at Spanish genuinely encouraging, and a young man named Billy Marsh, who was 22 and enthusiastic about everything in the way that 22-year-olds could be. Stephen showed her the operation with the pride of a man who was trying to be restrained about how much he wanted her to like it. The cattle were Herefords mostly, mixed with some Longhorn crosses, and they were in good condition. The fencing was recent and properly done. The well was deep and had never, Stephen confirmed when she asked with a slight catch of awareness, gone dry. On the drive back to Redemption in the late afternoon, they were quiet for a long time. The sky was doing something extraordinary with the sunset, painting the mesa walls in shades that had no names in any language she knew, and the air had turned cold and clean, and she had accepted the loan of his coat without thinking about it, and was sitting with it around her shoulders, and it occurred to her that she was happier in this moment than she had been in a very long time. "I want to ask you something," he said. His voice was careful and very even, which she had learned was what happened when he was speaking about something that mattered to him. "Then ask," she said. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins. "I know that you came here with a plan that didn't come out the way you expected," he said. "And I know that what you've built since then, the position, the house, the life here, you built that yourself and it's yours. I'm not trying to propose anything that changes what you've made. But I want to be honest with you about what I'm feeling because I think you deserve that, and because I would rather say it plainly than spend the next months finding ways not to say it." He paused, and the horses continued at their steady pace. "I have been falling in love with you since the day you told the general store that you could tell hinges from nails by the sound of the weight," he said. "That is not a conventional thing to say, and I apologize for it, but it's true. You are the most interesting person I have met in 8 years in this territory, and the most honest and the most competent, and I find myself on Thursday evenings thinking about Friday with a particular anticipation that I have not felt about anything in a very long time." He finally looked at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had seen it. "I am not asking for an answer tonight. I am just telling you because I have been raised to believe that honesty is a better building material than silence." She sat with that for the remainder of the drive, the coat warm on her shoulders and his words settling into her with the same quiet certainty as everything else about him. She gave him her answer that night at the door of the schoolhouse, after he had walked her from the wagon to her door in the dark with a lantern that made a small warm circle in the vast New Mexico night. "I have been falling in love with you too," she said. "Since approximately the same point, I think. You were very serious about those hinges." He laughed, a real laugh, not the almost smile she had been cataloging, but an actual sound of genuine amusement and relief, and it transformed his face entirely. "Caroline," he said. "Stephen," she said. They stood in the lantern light outside her door for a long moment, and then he took her hand very gently and held it, and the warmth of that contact went through her like the first real warmth of a sun that had been behind clouds for a very long time. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you'll allow it." "I am already being courted quite properly," she said. "You have been doing it for months." "Then I would like to continue, with the understanding of where it might be going." "I have the understanding," she said, "and the agreement." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was so old-fashioned and sincere that her heart turned over completely. "Good night, Miss Alden," he said. "Good night, Mr. Collier," she said, and went inside and leaned against the door and smiled at the ceiling of her small schoolhouse house for a very long time. November came in cold and windy, and absolutely beautiful in the way that the territory's seasons arrived, with a total commitment to themselves. The cottonwoods along the river bed that ran south of town went gold all at once, and the mesas changed colors with the shifting light in ways that she had begun to sketch in a small book she had started keeping, not because she had any talent for drawing, but because she needed some record of what she was seeing. The courtship, now acknowledged, changed only in its openness. He no longer stood a careful arm's length away when they walked. She no longer moderated the warmth in her voice when she spoke to him. They had their first argument in early November, about a territorial education proposal that she thought was inadequate, and he thought was better than nothing. And they argued for 45 minutes over Marguerite Salazar's green chili, and then walked home in the cold with their arms nearly touching. and the argument resolved into a kind of warm acknowledgement that they were both people who thought carefully and held positions, and were not going to simply agree with each other for convenience, which they had both independently identified as one of the things they found attractive about the other. He proposed to her formally on the first Sunday of December, in the afternoon, on the porch of the schoolhouse with a ring that had belonged to his mother, a small band of gold set with a pale green stone that he told her was a peridot. He was standing on the lower porch step so that they were at the same height, which she suspected was deliberate, and he said words that were as careful and honest as everything else he said, about partnership and respect and his very great and quite specific love for her. And she said yes before he had quite finished, because she had known what her answer was since October, and there was no reason to make him wait for it. The town of Redemption reacted to the engagement with the particular interested warmth of a small community that had watched the thing developing and was pleased to have its expectations confirmed. Mrs. Peabody told everyone she had known from the first Friday supper, which was true. Franklin Ames shook Stephen's hand at the general store and told him he was a lucky man. Marguerite Salazar gave them a free dinner and offered to make the wedding cake, which offer was accepted with genuine gratitude. Tom Bright shook Stephen's hand first and then, after a slight pause, offered his hand to Caroline too, and when she took it he said quietly, "He's a good man, Miss Alden. One of the best I've known." Coming from a man who she suspected had excellent judgment about character, having had to develop it out of necessity in a world that was not always just, she received this as the significant endorsement it was. They were married on a Saturday in February in the Redemption Baptist Church, with 14 school children in the first 2 pews because she had refused to choose which of them to exclude, and Tom Bright and the 4 ranch hands occupying the next pews in their best shirts, and Franklin Ames and his wife, and Marguerite Salazar and Mrs. Peabody, who wept from the first hymn onwards, and Hector Graves, the station agent who had delivered the worst news of her life, and who had shown up in the 3rd row looking pink and formal and moved. She wore the wedding dress she had sewn in 4 states. She had let it out slightly, because the months in the territory had given her the health that comes from clean air and purposeful work and meals she actually enjoyed, and she had replaced the Kansas button with one she found at the general store that matched better anyway, and she wore the ivory lace she had bought from the traveling merchant in Colorado and thought, this is what it was for. She came down the aisle on nobody's arm, because she had no family to offer the role, and she had decided, with the firm tranquility that was one of her characteristic qualities, that she was quite capable of walking toward her own future under her own power. Stephen was standing at the front of the church in a dark coat and a white shirt, and he was looking at her with an expression that she would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate words for, and the closest she would ever come was, as if she had stepped into a room he had been trying to build for a very long time, and he could finally see what it was supposed to look like. The ceremony was brief and formal, and exactly as serious as it should be. The words they exchanged, spoken by the Reverend Thomas Hale, whose voice had the useful quality of making everything sound both solemn and livable, settled around her like something solid being put down after a long carrying. When it was done and Stephen took her hand and they walked back down the aisle together into the February sunshine, bright and cold and generous with light, she heard one of her students, a 6-year-old named June Harper, whisper to her neighbor with great satisfaction, "That's our teacher." And she thought, yes, that's exactly right, she is. The wedding supper was at the hotel dining room, moved to the large parlor for the occasion, and Marguerite Salazar's cake was 3 layers of vanilla sponge with a lemon curd filling, and a white icing that impressed everyone and delighted the children. And there was dancing after the supper when someone produced a fiddle and someone else a small accordion, and Caroline danced until her feet complained and kept going past that point. because she was 26 years old on her wedding day in the New Mexico territory, and there was music and there was Stephen, who danced with careful attention to the steps and no pretense of being graceful about it, and she found this so endearing that she told him so right there on the dance floor, and he looked at her for a moment and then smiled. The full version, no reservation in it at all. They drove north to the ranch in the cold February dark, with a blanket over their laps and the stars so close and thick overhead that it was like looking up through a net of light. He helped her down from the wagon and they stood in the yard for a moment before he opened the house door, and she looked at the low ridge behind the house and the dark shapes of the corrals, and the one lamp burning in Tom Bright's small bunkhouse where he had thoughtfully waited up to make sure they arrived safely. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "Welcome home, Mrs. Collier." She stood in the yard of the ranch she had first seen in October, in the cold February night with her wedding dress under her traveling coat, and felt the word home settle into her with a complete and unreserved warmth. "Thank you," she said, "for meaning that." "I always mean what I say to you," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the reasons I married you." Inside, the house had been prepared. The fire was laid, and she later learned that Billy Marsh had come over in the afternoon to set it and sweep out the hearth and leave a bottle of wine from the general store on the table, because Tom had told him it was a civilized thing to do at a wedding, and Billy had very much wanted to be civilized about it. The small domestic gesture moved her almost as much as anything in the day had. The winter settled around the ranch with a comfortable severity. She continued teaching through the cold months, driving the 8 miles to Redemption and back 3 days a week on a schedule they worked out together, with Stephen making the drive when the weather was bad and Tom Bright covering when Stephen couldn't leave the animals. The other 2 days, she used to plan and prepare and keep the house with a satisfaction that was different from any satisfaction she had known before, the satisfaction of a life that had been chosen in all its specifics, and which was therefore entirely hers. She discovered the particular pleasures of ranch life in winter. The quality of the mornings, cold and blue and absolutely still. The sound of the cattle in the far corral. The smell of the coffee she made every morning in the cast iron pot on the wood stove while Stephen was in the barn, a domestic ritual that she had not expected to find meaningful and which she found deeply so. The evenings by the fire with their books, one on each side of the fireplace in the chairs she had positioned there in her first week, reading or talking or simply being in the same room together in the particular piece of 2 people who had found each other and were not going anywhere. In late March she realized she was carrying their first child. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told him, not from uncertainty about how to feel but because she wanted to be sure, and because there was something she wanted to keep private for just a little while longer, just for herself. The knowledge of this thing that was growing in the territory spring, alongside the first green shoots of the cottonwoods, and the reopening of the vegetable garden and her own life which was, she thought, also in the business of becoming. She told him on a Sunday evening when the spring sunset was doing its particular brilliance over the western mesas, and they were on the porch with their coffee. "I have something to tell you," she said. He set down his cup and turned to look at her with the full attention he gave to things that mattered. "We are going to have a child," she said. "In the autumn, I think." For a moment he was entirely still, in the way he went still when something surprised him past the range of his usual composure. Then he said, very quietly, "Caroline." And then, before she could respond to the specific weight of her name in his voice, he set down his cup, stood up from his chair, crossed the 2 porch boards between them, and kissed her with a tenderness that had everything in it, relief and joy and gratitude and something else too, something she had not had a word for until that moment, and which she would later decide was the particular feeling of a man who has discovered that the life he built is more than adequate. "Are you happy?" she asked against his shoulder. "I am in a state I don't have sufficient vocabulary for," he said. "Happy will do," she said. Happy will do, he agreed. She told the school children before she told almost anyone else, because they were the people she spent the most time with, and because she believed in being straightforward with children about life, and they received the information with the interested seriousness of small people who understood that babies were significant business. June Harper, who had appointed herself Caroline's particular ally, immediately announced that she hoped it was a girl and that she should be named June. Caroline told her it was a very fine name for a very fine person and committed to nothing, which was the professional response. The pregnancy progressed through the spring with a remarkable straightforwardness that she was sensible enough to be grateful for rather than taking it for granted. She was tired in the early weeks and somewhat particular about certain smells, and entirely irrationally devoted to eating corn bread, which Stephen procured for her with a dedication that she found alternately amusing and profoundly touching. By summer she was well and energetic and teaching until mid-August, when Franklin Ames suggested with some delicacy that the visible evidence of her condition was making certain parents uncertain, and she said crisply that human reproduction was a natural event, and that if certain parents required an education on the subject she would be happy to provide one, and Franklin Ames, who had spent considerable time being managed by his wife and several of the school board mothers, and who therefore had a healthy respect for determined women, suggested on reflection that perhaps she could determine her own schedule. She finished the term in late August and returned to the ranch full-time, which is when the territory, which had given her a very good spring and summer in exchange for its demands, delivered a late summer that was honest about its nature. Scorching, dry, relentlessly brilliant, making the air shimmer and the distances waver and the cattle bad-tempered with the heat. Stephen brought in ice from the town twice a week for her, and set a second cistern closer to the house for washing so she didn't have to walk to the well in the heat, and he moved his working hours to the earliest morning and late evening to be inside during the worst of the afternoon, and he slept with one hand resting lightly on her side most nights in a way she was not sure he was conscious of, but which she found entirely comforting. Tom Bright's wife, a quiet woman named Ruth who had come to live on the ranch in June, proved to be a gift that Caroline had not anticipated. Ruth knew plants and medicines, and she knew the things that the territory doctors sometimes did not, and she was a steady and sensible presence through the last weeks of the pregnancy when steadiness and sense were the qualities most required. Their son was born on the 14th of October, in the early morning when the sky was still dark, and the first cold had come down from the mountains overnight, and the air through the bedroom window was finally cool and clean. He was born with a surprising vigorous protest at the interruption of his previous arrangements and a quantity of dark hair that delighted everyone. He weighed a gratifying amount and was declared by Ruth and by Dr. Frank Aldridge, who had ridden out from Redemption at Stephen's urgent request, to be entirely healthy and entirely excellent. Stephen held him for the first time standing by the bedroom window, the infant wrapped in the blanket Caroline's aunt had sent from St. Louis when she had written about the expected child, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, more open even than on the morning he had told her he was falling in love with her. He looked at the child the way he looked at the good land, with a love that was practical and permanent and had no room in it for performance. "What do you think?" she asked from the bed where Ruth had firmly installed her with instructions to stay. "He looks extremely determined," Stephen said, which made her laugh, and the baby startled at the sound and opened his eyes briefly. "He can have your stubbornness," she said, "and my organizational skills and will be satisfied." "What is his name?" She had been considering this for months. "James," she said. "James Thomas Collier. James after nobody in particular, because I think some people should be the first person to have their name in a family. Thomas for Tom." He looked at her over the top of the infant's head. "Tom will appreciate that," he said. "Tom will insist he doesn't care and then be moved by it," she said, because she had taken considerable measure of Tom Bright over the past year, and she was fairly confident in her assessment. She was correct. Tom received the information about his namesake with a composed dignity that lasted approximately 30 seconds before he excused himself to attend to something outside and came back 5 minutes later with very steady eyes and a very precise attention to the middle distance. James Thomas Collier grew through that first winter with a commitment to the enterprise of existence that charmed everyone on the ranch and exhausted his parents in the productive, warm way that infant children were supposed to. He had Stephen's eyes, those storm-colored eyes, and Caroline's stubbornness, which rather than being distributed between them had apparently arrived doubled in this small person who refused to sleep unless the conditions were exactly right, and who had opinions about his meals from the age of 3 weeks. The ranch expanded the following spring when Stephen bought an additional section of land to the east, property that had become available when its previous owner moved to Santa Fe, and the cattle herd grew to 450 head. Billy Marsh turned 23 and fell moderately in love with the blacksmith's eldest daughter, a sturdy and confident young woman named Adela Reyes, and the courtship provided considerable entertainment for the rest of the ranch, not least because Adela was clearly the more capable participant, and Billy appeared to find this simultaneously terrifying and completely wonderful. Caroline returned to the school in September of 1885, with James in the custody of Ruth Bright on teaching days, an arrangement that worked beautifully, and that she and Ruth had worked out together with the practical intelligence of two women who understood that the ideal arrangement was the one that actually functioned. Franklin Ames had initially expressed some reservations about a married mother returning to the classroom, and she had sat him down and explained her qualifications and record, and the particular value to the female students of having a woman in front of the classroom who had built a life of her own, and Franklin Ames had agreed again that she could determine her own schedule. The school grew through the mid-1880s as redemption grew. New families arrived with the continued expansion of the railroad, farmers and shopkeepers and tradespeople from Texas and Colorado, and as far as Virginia and Pennsylvania, and the school enrollment rose to 22 students by 1886 and then to 27 by 1887. She asked the school board for a second teacher and got one after a 6-month negotiation, a young man just out of normal school in Albuquerque named Samuel Park, who was earnest and organized and who, to his great credit, deferred to her authority without making a project out of it. Stephen watched her build the school with the same attention he gave everything important to him, and he contributed to it in the ways available to him, speaking to the school board on behalf of new resources, organizing the other ranchers in the area for the timber drive when they needed to expand the school building in 1886, building the bookshelves himself in his workshop on winter evenings when the ranch work went quiet. He was present at every school exhibition, sitting in the 3rd row with Tom Bright and James on his lap, and his applause was the most reliable sound in the room. Their second child arrived in June of 1887, a daughter they named Margaret, and she was from her first hour a person of particular grace and absolute determination, which those who knew her parents found entirely explicable. James, who was 3½, regarded her with the serious attention of a person conducting an assessment of a new variable in a previously understood system, and within a week had decided she was acceptable, which meant he sat beside her bassinet and talked to her about the horses in a running monologue that she appeared to find entirely satisfactory. Redemption itself was changing. The 1880s were a decade of transformation for the territory, the slow, grinding, complicated work of a place becoming something it had not previously been, with all the injustices and displacements that accompanied that becoming. The Apache people, whose land the territory had been before it was anyone else's, were being pushed onto reservations with the particular brutal efficiency that the federal government reserved for this work. And Caroline taught her students about this with an honesty that made some parents uncomfortable. She believed that children who were going to inherit the land had an obligation to understand what the inheritance had cost other people, and she said this plainly and without apology, and the parents who objected were outnumbered by the parents who, on reflection, agreed. Stephen had his own views on this, shaped by 8 years of watching the territory and by his working relationship with Tom Bright, who understood very well what it meant to have one's presence in a place held conditional on other people's tolerance. He did not preach about it, because preaching was not his method, but he ran his operation with a fairness that did not depend on the law to enforce it, and he treated every person who worked for him and every neighbor who came to him with the same level of respect, which in 1887 New Mexico was still a political statement even when it was just good manners. Ernesto, the quiet hand from Mexico, had learned enough English by 1887 to hold a proper conversation, and Caroline had learned enough Spanish to hold a different kind, and the two of them had developed a friendship based on a mutual respect for careful attention and good food. The latter because Ernesto turned out to be an excellent cook, who occasionally made Sunday dinners for the whole ranch that were so good they made Billy Marsh close his eyes in concentration. The years settled into themselves with the comfortable weight of a life fully inhabited. James grew tall and thoughtful, with his father's patience and his mother's precision, and he was riding with competence by the age of 7 and reading above his age level almost from the start, which she took entirely personally as an achievement. Margaret grew into a child of extraordinary social intelligence, who could walk into any room and within 5 minutes understand every relationship in it, which Stephen said was purely her mother's gift, and which Caroline was inclined to agree with. In the autumn of 1889, New Mexico began the long, complicated process toward statehood, a process that would take another 20 years to complete, but which changed the quality of the territory's self-understanding even in its beginning. Redemption held town meetings about it that filled the meeting hall past capacity, and Caroline attended every one, occasionally with one or both children asleep against her shoulder, and always with strong opinions about the education provisions in any proposed state constitution, which she expressed with the clarity and precision of a woman who had spent years making her arguments count. Stephen ran for the County Water Board in 1890 and won, which surprised him and surprised no one who knew him, because his reputation for fairness and his knowledge of the land were both impeccable. He served 2 terms and came home from every meeting talking about water rights with the concentrated frustration of a man who understood the problem better than the solutions being proposed. And some of their best conversations were the ones they had in the late evenings about what he had decided, and why. The two of them at the kitchen table with their coffee going cold, while they worked through the logic of the thing. James turned 10 in October of 1894, and they had a birthday supper that included Tom and Ruth Bright and Billy Marsh and his wife, because Billy and Adela had been married in 1888 in a ceremony where Billy had been so overwhelmed with feeling that he had twice forgotten the words, and Marguerite Salazar and her husband, and Samuel Park from the school, and several neighboring families whose children were James's particular friends. The long table in the main room of the ranch house, extended with the extra board Stephen had made for it 3 years ago, was so full of people and noise, and the smell of Ernesto's cooking that it seemed to Caroline that the house was demonstrating what it had always been built to hold. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment watching the table, James arguing good-naturedly with the Henderson boy about something, Margaret instructing her younger cousin in a point of significant importance, Stephen at the far end talking water rights with a rancher named Cal Dawson, who had ridden 10 miles to attend a 10-year-old's birthday supper. Tom Bright and Ruth beside each other with the comfortable closeness of people who had built a life alongside another life and found the proximity good. And she was conscious of an emotion so large and specific that she needed a moment to hold it properly. She had come to redemption with $42 and a wedding dress sewn in 4 states, and the news that everything she had planned had ended before it started. And she had been standing at a station counter with a patient man telling her he was sorry. And she had walked off that platform and into this life that was so completely hers that she could not imagine any of the paths not taken leading somewhere better. The man at the station had been sorry. He had been sorry because the stranger she came to marry was gone. And he could not have known, and she could not have known, and Gerald Whitmore could certainly not have known, that standing in the dust of that platform between arrival and grief, there was something waiting that had nothing to do with plans and everything to do with the particular stubborn hopefulness of a woman who keeps walking. She went back to the birthday table and sat down next to her husband, who moved his arm to make room for her with the unconscious fluency of a man who has been making room for a particular person for 7 years and has no memory of not doing it. He leaned close and said quietly, "Everything all right?" "Everything is exactly right," she said. He looked at her with those eyes, and he knew what she meant because he always knew what she meant. And he covered her hand with his on the table in the particular way he had, briefly and warmly and without ceremony. Across the table, Margaret was watching them with the expression of a child who has catalogued every significant thing in her world and knows precisely which ones matter most. "Papa," Margaret said, with the focused clarity of a 7-year-old making an announcement, "when I grow up I want to get married at the Baptist church too." "You have some time to decide," Stephen said. "I've decided," Margaret said. "You're 7," James said, with the exhausted authority of an older sibling. "I know what I know," Margaret said, which was so precisely her mother's phrase that the table around them laughed, and Caroline laughed hardest. The house held the sound of it, all that warm noise in the territory night, the wind outside and the stars so close and thick overhead, and the lamp burning on the long table and the coffee going cold. And it held them all, this family and this life, with the particular faithfulness of a house that was built to last. 2 years later, when James was 12 and Margaret was 9, and Caroline was pregnant again with the child they had not precisely planned, but had greeted with the immediate wholehearted welcome of people who knew the value of what they had. She walked into the school on a Monday morning in March and found a letter on her desk from the Territorial Education Board in Santa Fe. She read it standing at her desk with her coat still on and her scarf still around her neck, and the morning light coming through the window she had replaced the pane in 8 years ago. And the letter said that the board was establishing a regional supervisory position covering 6 counties in the Central Territory, with a responsibility for curriculum standards and teacher training, and the assessment of educational needs in growing communities. And that her name had been put forward by no fewer than 4 separate members of the board as the best qualified candidate in the region. She sat down in her chair and read it again. She walked home that afternoon with the letter in her pocket and thought about it all the way home, and she went into the house and took off her coat and hat and sat at the kitchen table, and when Stephen came in from the south pasture, she showed him the letter without saying anything. He read it twice. She watched his face while he read it, the careful attention and the slight increase in stillness that meant he was working out the implications. "This is what you're supposed to be doing," he said. "It would mean traveling," she said, "not continuously but regularly." "We have Tom and Ruth," he said, "and Billy and Adela and Ernest. And you have been managing this school and this ranch and this family and teaching 27 children at the same time. If anyone can do this, it is you. I want to know what you think," she said, "not what you think I want to hear." He set the letter on the table between them and looked at her. "I think you are the best teacher in this territory and one of the most capable people I know, and I think the children of 6 counties will be better educated because of this and that matters." And I think that our children will have a mother who teaches them by example that a woman can build something beyond the walls of her own house, and that also matters." He paused. "And I think that you sat down in this kitchen chair with that letter in your pocket, and that means you want it. So yes, you should do it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are," she said, "a very good man." "You have told me that before," he said. "I continue to find it true." She accepted the position. She began in the autumn of 1892, traveling by horse or wagon to the 6 counties in her region, visiting schools and speaking to teachers and parents and community leaders and school boards with the same direct and patient attention she had brought to Redemption School 8 years ago. She was, almost universally, well received. She was also, occasionally, received with the particular skepticism reserved for a woman appearing in a professional capacity in a territory where that was still not the expected thing. And she addressed this skepticism with such a complete professional command that the skeptics generally came around within an hour, or revised their public position if they did not. Her third child, a boy they named Henry, was born in the spring of 1892, and he arrived with such cheerful immediacy, and such a sunny, uncomplicated temperament that everyone who met him in his first year was briefly convinced that life was simpler than it appeared. He grew up on the ranch with the horses and the wide New Mexico sky as his primary companions, and he had his grandfather Collier's Virginia coloring, fair where his siblings were dark, and an easy smile that he dispensed freely, and that Ruth Bright said was God's way of ensuring the household had a reasonable ratio of trouble to sweetness. The 1890s were years of consolidation. The ranch was solid and well run. The school region was improving in measurable ways that Caroline tracked in the careful records she kept, the same way Stephen tracked his water accounts and his cattle numbers. They had disagreements, because they were people who thought carefully about things and who did not always arrive at the same conclusion, and their arguments were still the good kind, the kind that clarified things, and they always ended with something being understood that hadn't been before, which was their mutual standard for what a disagreement was supposed to accomplish. James, at 16, began to show a serious interest in the legal questions around water rights that had been the subject of so many kitchen table conversations, and he came to Stephen one evening in 1900 and said, with the formal precision of a young man who has prepared what he wants to say, that he wanted to read law, that he wanted to go to school for it, that he wanted to come back to the territory and do the kind of work that changed the conditions rather than the kind that managed within them. Stephen and Caroline sat with this request in the particular thoughtful way they sat with things that had significant implications, and they talked about it honestly, including the cost and the practicalities and the distance and what it would mean for the ranch, and then they told him yes. Because the water board had taught Stephen that the law was where the important arguments happened, and because Caroline had spent a decade watching what education did to a person's range of possibilities, and because James had his father's patience and his mother's precision, and those were the qualities a good lawyer needed. Margaret, at 17, had decided she wanted to teach, which Caroline received with a complicated mixture of pride and the specific worry of a woman who knew exactly what the profession required and what it cost. She told Margaret honestly about both things, and Margaret received this information with the expression of a person who has already made their decision and is listening to the objections out of respect rather than uncertainty, which was entirely familiar. Henry, at 9, wanted to run cattle. This desire required no particular discussion or support, only the opportunity, which the ranch provided daily. On a Sunday afternoon in the early spring of 1901, Caroline and Stephen rode out together to the eastern section of the ranch, the land he had bought in 1886 that had the best view in the territory if you went to the right rise, a low rocky prominence from which the mesa country opened in every direction with that complete and gorgeous indifference to human scale. They went most Sunday afternoons if the weather allowed, with or without the children depending on the week. It was the tradition of their life together, this Sunday ride, and it had accumulated 18 years of meaning. They stopped at the top of the rise and let the horses rest and looked out at the country, which was doing what it did in early spring, returning from winter with a careful, incremental seriousness, the first green in the arroyos and the cottonwood buds barely visible from this distance and the light still young and clear. "Do you ever think about Missouri?" he asked. She considered the question. "Sometimes," she said. "The green. I miss the green sometimes in the dry months. But not enough to want it instead of this." "No," he said, and they were both quiet for a while. "I was thinking about Hector Graves," she said, "the station agent. He retired last year. He told me at the Christmas social, 31 years at that window." She paused. "He told me he was sorry, the first day. He stood there and he took off his hat and he said, 'I am very sorry,' and he meant it. He had no idea that it was the best news I would ever receive." Stephen looked at her. "That seems harsh on Gerald Whitmore," he said. "I did not know Gerald Whitmore," she said. "I corresponded with him for 6 weeks and I know he was a decent man who wanted a good life and didn't live to have it. I'm sorry for him, but I am not sorry for what happened to me as a result. I am not capable of being sorry for that." He was quiet for a moment. "Neither am I," he said. The horses shifted and blew steam in the cool air, and the distance spread itself before them in every direction, red rock and pale sky, and the thin lines of the ranch fences far below. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in Redemption Station with $42 and a dress she had sewn in 4 states. And she found that woman to be recognizably herself, present in every cell of the life that had followed from that platform, and she was glad of her. Glad of her stubbornness and her practicality and her refusal to go back when going forward was an option. And she was glad too of the town and the school and the rough, enormous, serious beauty of the territory that had asked so much of her and given more back. And she was glad above all of the man beside her who had appeared on a boardwalk with a paper bag of hinges, and had looked at her with those eyes, and who had spent 18 years being exactly what he was. Steady and honest and interesting and hers. She reached over and found his hand and held it, and he turned his palm up and held hers back, and they sat like that at the top of the rise, while the spring light moved slowly across the country below them, and the horses stood in the patient way of horses that know they are not going anywhere in a hurry. "I want to stay a while," she said. "As long as you like," he said. They stayed until the shadows started to lengthen, and the air went cool in that definitive way that meant it was time. And then they rode back down through the arroyos and across the flats to the ranch, where Henry was in the corral, with Ernesto doing something involving a rope, and a fence post that probably had a good reason behind it, and where the kitchen smelled of whatever Ruth had left on the stove, and where Margaret's horse was in the yard, which meant she had come home from a visit to her friend in town, and where Tom Bright was sitting on the step of the bunkhouse with his pipe, and lifted a hand as they rode in with the easy acknowledgement of a man greeting the people whose life he had been part of for 20 years. Stephen took the horses and she went inside and set the coffee to heat, and stood in her kitchen in the ranch house with the glass windows and the well that had never gone dry, with the books on the shelf and the children's drawings still tacked to the wall above the washstand, and the peridot ring on her left hand that she had not taken off in 18 years. And she listened to the sounds of the ranch around her, the horses settling, Henry's voice in the corral, Tom's footsteps on the path, and presently Stephen's boots on the porch, and she thought, this is what it was supposed to be, not the plan she had made in Missouri, not the careful correspondence with a decent stranger, not the advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette or the 9 days on the train or the folded dress in the carpetbag, or any of the specific hopes she had carried across 4 states. But the life underneath all of that, the life that had been waiting in Redemption Station behind the man with the walrus mustache and the ink-stained thumb who had taken off his hat and said he was sorry, who had delivered the news that ended one story and began another, who could not have known and did not need to know that the word sorry had nothing to stand on, that there was nothing in this outcome that required apology. Stephen came through the door and hung his hat on the hook and looked at her across the kitchen. "Coffee's almost ready," she said. "Good," he said, and sat down at the kitchen table where they had talked about water rights and education policy and children and land in the future, and all the ordinary profound things that made up a life. And she poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat across from him in the lamplight of the kitchen of the house they had made together. He looked at her over his coffee cup with those storm-colored eyes that had not changed since the boardwalk in 1883, and she looked back at him, and there was everything between them that 18 years could build, all of it visible in the simple fact of sitting across a table from each other at the end of a Sunday in their life. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "All of it. Good all of it or bad all of it?" "Good," she said. "All of it good." Outside the ranch house, the territory evening arrived with its usual completeness, the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky like lights being lit in windows of a house too large to see all at once, and the wind moved through the scrub with a sound she had learned to love and could not imagine not hearing, and somewhere on the south pasture, one of the cattle voiced an opinion about something. And Henry came in from the corral smelling of horse and rope, and asking what was for supper with the frank priority of a 9-year-old boy. And Margaret appeared from the back hallway with a book in her hand, saying she had found the one Caroline had been looking for last week. And the kitchen, filled up with the noise and warmth of a household in full possession of itself. She looked at Stephen over the noise and the coffee and the lamplight, and he was already looking at her because he almost always was, and she smiled and he answered it with the full version of his own, the one with no reservation in it. And the ranch house held them all in the New Mexico night with the faithfulness of something built to last and built to hold, and it did both, and it would.